This is my half moon theory, and radiation is magic theory, and a little bit on my Planetos is ginormous theory. This is kind of an overarching view of Planetos' history, and background in the Song of Ice and Fire universe is I have read most of the prequels, The Dragon Sons, The Rogue Prince, Princess and the Queen, and all of the Night books. I don't have the books, and I listen to them mostly on audiobook, so I can't really give exact page numbers or anything, and I don't necessarily, no offense, feel like going back and getting the exact quotes and having to write them down word for word and all that stuff. But if anybody would like to verify or just prove something that I've said, please do so in the comments, and I will list all inaccuracies and deviations that I made, and then also list any things that I did do right by the page and the quotes that people will provide, hopefully. But this is an overarching view of Planetos' history, and so it doesn't necessarily need a quoting, but there are some pieces that I do remember in several of the books that I want to bring up. So hopefully my memory proves good. This is mostly unscripted, however I did do a slight rough draft here just to keep myself on point, so it's not a 45-minute lecture of me going and but then blah blah, because I will do that. So I think I'll start with Planetos is huge. I think that the map that we are provided is maybe about a quarter, or maybe like a quarter of the size of Planetos. And I believe it's actually an ice planet that essentially it's an ice and a rock planet, and the axis is spinning towards the sun, and it used to be a lot more stable to where like half of the planet was roasted from the sun because it was constantly faced by the sun, and that was because Planetos had two moons that kept its axis in relative balance, so there was like this time of always summer. But the other half of the planet was an ice planet, and I think that the planet as it is now is a result of this other moon being destroyed. And my theory comes from listening to the Vassals of Kingsgrave and their first part of the great A Song of Ice and Fire reread. And at 1:27:14 they start talking about dragon's eggs and them reacting to Dany and possibly the sunlight and fire from the brazier and stuff. and this will come into play a little bit later. But the main part is when White Raven, or I can't remember. I'm very sorry. I can't remember the British woman who was talking's name. I'll hopefully list it down below. But at 1:28:31, she asks White Raven about his weather theory, and he says, "Oh, it's more of a climate theory." And he talks about the other moon, which he and I both believe to be an oily black moon that dragons evolved on. And I want to go one step further in what he says, in that I think that the oily black stone in and of itself is what dragons evolved from, in the same way that animals evolved from algae, that evolved into zooplankton, that evolved into insectoid bacteria, stuff like that, and eventually became animals and multicelled organisms. So what I believe is that the oily black stone evolved on a planet that was full of iron and uranium and lead and all of this radioactive and radio nullifier. I don't know the name for that. Like, you line something with lead and it's not going to get permeated by radioactive stuff, that kind of thing, an insulator. So it evolved on this planet, and it was an extremophile, like we have at the bottom of ocean vents. So it's these organisms that love extreme environments, and that organism started evolving off of all of the minerals and substances and amino acids that were on that planet, and it evolved into this kind of super dense, super slow growing fungus, and it took millions of years. And I think this is where I should bring in the fact that I think Planetos orbits a sun that's in kind of the last stages of its life. So it's at first, when life was evolving on Planetos and life was evolving on this oily black moon, the sun was kind of giving off giant bursts of radioactive energy, and solar flares and solar bursts and things like that. And the organisms on the oily black moon fed on this shit, and they real quick learned how to absorb exorbitant amounts of radiation and then to expel that. And this is the radiation is magic theory, is that this oily black stone is really good at retaining and holding in radiation, and then when one part of the moon isn't getting, or one part of the giant oily black organism was not getting enough radiation, it would transfer it. So it could retain radiation and then expel radiation, or move radiation to parts of itself that needed it. And dragons evolved in the same way. They were like proto-zooplankton things that eventually evolved into multi-celled little radioactive germs that evolved and ate each other and turned into a vast array of things. And that the pinnacle of this was like black moon dragons, and they would absorb certain certain radiations and certain light waves that corresponded with their body colors, so they would absorb all of those um, radio waves and then could store it and then expel it as fire. And that's what dragons do. And so they evolved in this way. And then in the same way on Planetos, I believe that the first organisms were kind of this floating algae precursor to the Weir network or the Weirwoods. So essentially I believe that in the same way that plants on Earth evolved from the dead biomass of old ocean organisms washing onto land and then mixing with the minerals and providing root systems to start growing and stuff like that. There was this weird algae or this weird fungus that kind of grew on the melted surface of this ice planet that was at this north pole that was constantly facing the sun. And so it got heat, it got the radiation, and it grew in these oceans. And eventually it evolved into the life that's on Planetos, much in the same way that life evolved here on Earth. With the only exception being that all the organisms, all of the deer, the dire wolves, the mammoths, the giants, the children of the forest, and the others, especially the others, evolved to where they had to absorb a lot of radiation and expel a lot of radiation, because while the sun was constantly shining on this one part, they did have night and day in the same way that we would have it in the North Pole where it's a proscenium. And so you'll have like months on end where it's daytime and months on end when it's always night and stuff like that. It's just that something happened in the past when the first human kind of beings were evolving out of, I think, Essos and Yeti, and I think the first men actually evolved under kind of like the Mother of Mountains and were the Dothraki, and some of them went across the Arm of Dorn into Westeros, where weirwoods were the main life form that evolved, and then other things just kind of washed up on the weirwoods, and the weirwoods kind of just absorbed and remembered, and it's kind of like this giant fungus network and this tree root system that's under everything because it was there before everything else. But the weirwood trees were in Westeros, which is, I believe, was in kind of the most mild climate, to where the children of the forest evolved in this area as well, and there was a more consistent night and day system, to where it wasn't like months or years or days on end, but it was more like, just long days, long nights, and it was all good all the time because it was basically the time of always summer. And then something happened, and it happened, I believe, when the sun kind of started going into the very last stages of its life cycle, where it only has like another 5 million years, which is not a long time for a star, but would certainly be long enough to start legends and myths. from the people who survived. And I believe it actually happened at the perfect time, because it would have happened like during a lunar eclipse, when they would have, for the first time, very rarely been able to see the oily black moon, because normally if it goes across the sun, or goes across the sky, it's gonna absorb all the light, so you're not gonna see it very well. It's like the night sky. It'll just be invisible, I think. I'm not sure if that's how it actually works. Maybe it would be more visible. I don't know. If it was white, it would be more invisible. That's why we can see our moon during the day sometimes. Anyway. But at night, it would just be like this empty space. And you wouldn't even be able to see it, except for maybe like some fire coming from dragons and stuff. And man, that would look badass, wouldn't it? Just like look up and there's a dark space, but every once in a while there's like a what the fuck, dude. And so yeah, people would know about it, wouldn't they? And they would know it was a black moon, and that it was where dragons came from, because it was at black moon lunar eclipse that the sun went kind of nova. Not nova, but nova-ish. I don't know what that's called when it kind of sheds a thing. But the moon, since it was made of black rock, would have absorbed most of the radiation that would have covered, or that would have destroyed Planetos, right? So it was kind of this barrier. And dragons live on this radiation, but it still would have been too much for them. Like, everything needs water, but if you throw, you know, a tortoise in a pond, it's probably gonna drown. You know, but some eggs and some dragons would have survived this and would have fed on it, and it would have been the more powerful dragons. But I think that the moon mostly fell into Planetos, like it got knocked into this orbit. But a piece of it, a big piece of it, was knocked out of orbit and into space, and that's what the red comet is. And so I think there were like 3 big pieces, and then 1 giant piece that fell to Planetos. And there were 2 smaller pieces of these 4, and those landed in the north to create the hot springs beneath Winterfell, and the 14 flames. The second biggest piece is the Shadowlands beyond Ashai. And then I believe the biggest piece landed on the South Pole after a deteriorating orbit, and landed in the Lands of Always Winter, which is basically just the rest of the planet. And the first 3 were not as bad, especially because Planetos is huge in this theory. So, like, it caused some cracks in the crust, but it didn't really do much more than that. And, like, the atmosphere would be so much denser, which is why things can become so much bigger. And, so when this thing happened, it would be, like, more pressurized, more contained, and it wouldn't spread out as much. But in the Lands of Always Winter, it would have been very devastating, because it was the size of the other 3 basically combined in this theory. and it killed most of the White Walkers. And I believe that the White Walkers and the Children of the Forest um, were kind of evolved out of the same thing, which was closer to the weirwoods. It was like a lizard thing, but the White Walkers went one way and the Children of the Forest went another. But there was an ancestral species that was between them, and this one was um, very, very symbiotic with the weirwood network and the radiation that is shared through it. And so these were very adept species at radiation absorption, manipulation, and expulsion. And so the White Walkers, when the moon was still in orbit, were constantly getting fed, like once a day or once every couple of days, because maybe it would take longer for the moon to get around unless it was just orbiting one pole. I don't know if that's even possible. Like a geosynchronous moon that's kind of moving. But since the moon had so much radiation and it moved, they would be able to absorb this radiation, use it while they had it. But when the moon went away, they would have to keep it in instead of expelling it. And they became adept at doing this in winter climates. So it's not necessarily that the White Walkers are or were at one point ice beings. It's that they were adept at living in extreme environments. And this comes into play later with the Valyrians. So the biggest piece lands in the Lands of Always Winter, wipes out most of the White Walkers, and the ones that don't no longer have the benefit of the moon over them. But the ones who do survive and do find this giant chunk of moon that has broken into this giant subterranean ocean on this ice planet and embedded itself in the crust of this giant ice ocean, essentially is a giant food source for them. So for a long time, others evolve around this moon, and they are constantly absorbing radiation from it, and constantly getting more powerful, and constantly getting better at living in this extreme environment. And at the same time, an ass ton of dragon eggs are going to be found there. And, this might be the source of ice dragons, is that they tamed dragons so that the dragons would absorb radiation, like from the extremist of environments, even in ice fields, to where dragons will freeze things in their attempt to absorb as much radiation out of the environment as possible, as much heat, as much of the things that they survived on and thrived on the moon. And that blood and blood sacrifice is a very big thing in this, because all of the beings that evolved on Planetos evolved in this same way, to be able to work with magic, essentially work with radiation. And so when they sacrifice, when they found these dragons, and they were much weakened because they were no longer in their home environment, it was a lot heavier here. White Raven talks about this. They couldn't evolve on Planetos with iron bones and the kinds of bodies that they have. Like Vagar is described so often as huge and lumberous and slow, and like, how the fuck does Vagar fly? It's because Vagar is constantly getting fed and constantly growing and constantly like, and that's why dragons kill each other a lot, is because absorbing another dragon's power, another dragon's accumulated radiation, adds to its own. And that's why I didn't I've never been able to hear how Balerion died. I've just heard that he did, and Viserys never took him out after Balerion died. But that Rhaenyra loved to fly, and that was in The Princess and the Queen. But it seems like they don't fucking die ever, unless they're murdered by another dragon. Like, they just get bigger and more pissed off. So, as long as they're constantly being fed and they constantly have this food source, they can grow. And the dragons that went under the crust with the moon, the black oily moon, coming pretty much to the very bottom, some dragon eggs obviously fell down there and maybe fell next to volcanic vents like we had in our oceans, and they were birthed underwater. And like, since they don't come from our planet, they don't live off of the same things that we would live off of. It's not like a dragon needs to breathe in oxygen in order to live. If a dragon needed to breathe oxygen, they would be exploding all the fucking time. The same with nitrogen. And that's what we need to survive, and that's what we mostly have in our stuff. They breathe out because they're like a gill. They're like a radiation gill, and that's what a dragon essentially is. They take in radiation, and then they can expel radiation at an astronomical rate, creating fuck tons of fire. But it's not that they necessarily breathe the way we do. It's that they breathe radiation, and if they're down at the bottom of these vents, they would be absorbing all of this heat. And so sea dragons could be a thing, and they could absorb the radiation, and that could cause ice, but what they breathe out would still be fire. It might be a more concentrated fire, like more precise and more laser-like, because they would have to filter it through water, but I think it would cause boiling, and they would still be fire made flesh. It's just that they are another extremophile, another breed of dragon. And I believe that the Valyrian dragons, the dragons of the Shadowlands, and ice dragons are three separate species of dragons. That the Valyrians and the Shadow people don't have necessarily the same dragons, but because they were both, how do you say, both in the more summer lands, the northern part of Planetos, that is getting a more even spread of days and years. Although that's why the seasons are now messed up, is because the axis is off tilt, and they'll have 2-3 years of winter, and then 5-6 years of summer, and then and it's constantly wobbling. So, like, the maesters will eventually catch up to this, because if they have constant recorded data, eventually one of them is going to be like, well, now we're in a pattern. And if it's true, then the next year will be a 3-year winter, oh, see, it was 3.5. Like, it's increasing a little bit, so maybe next year it'll be a 5-year winter. Oh, it's 5.5 years. See, now we gotta increase it, and now we know. And it's just a matter of time. But that's how it happened in our world. Is they were like, guys, we have all of this data. We're not fucking stupid. It's just that they don't realize that magic is an integral part of their world. And, yeah. Anyway, I think that's kind of the theory, is radiation is magic, and, like, all of the species on Westeros evolved to be able to absorb and expel this magic, and that's why blood sacrifice is such a big freaking deal, is because the more radiation you can absorb from another life form, the stronger you will become, and that's why, like, knighthood is such a big thing, and, oh, that's the other thing, is, that's why stars are so important. Like the seven-pointed star, it's said that that actually came, I can't remember where I heard this, so it might be bullshit, but somewhere I heard that the, Andal religion of the god of seven faces came from the Bloodstone Emperor, who worshipped a black oily stone that fell from the sky because it'd probably been absorbing radiation for a long ass time, and he could get so much power from it. And that's so. Sorry, that's the other thing, and I gotta say this before I go on with the thing I was just talking about, which I already forgot. But that's what happened with the Long Night, is that the White Walkers eventually absorbed all of the radiation out of the chunk of moon that landed in the lands of always winter. And for the first time, they were cold. Like, they didn't have a constant source of radiation. They were faced away from the sun constantly. So it's no wonder that all of a sudden they go to the other side of the world, because they needed to. They needed a place to absorb more radiation, and that's why when they go to a place, it looks like winter is coming with them, because they're just absorbing all of that shit and using it for their own power now. They're having to do this. And the original end to the war is, I think, when men and the White Walkers came to an understanding with one another, and the children of the forest, and all of this stuff happened. And I think the pact on the Isle of Faces was actually between humans, the children, and White Walkers. And Valyrians are descended from White Walkers in this theory, because they just came out of the lands of always winter, and they're just another subspecies, and they're not necessarily related to the humans, who are another species, which is why the blood of the dragon has to be pure and shit like that. And, anyway, Long Night came because they absorbed all the radiation. They needed more, so they came here, fucked over everybody, and then Children of the Forest and men fought back with the power of the comet. But I think the comet passed a lot closer during the damn it, what's it called? When the long night ended, the first dawn, not the first dawn. Anyway, during that time, the comet came and like, holy shit, radiation is fuck, and uh, dude who had pure first men blood held up his sword and fucking fire came out and he's like, yeah. White Walkers are like, oh shit, they also got magic. But they're like, yeah. And so it was this giant battle and they finally agreed, like, holy shit, we're going to murder each other because we're so fucking powerful. And this is when the Age of Heroes happened, is after the Long Night, because a whole bunch of heroic shit could have happened, and like they could have lived for like 1,000 years because they were like, I got so much energy to burn. But yeah. So I think this is a good place to end. I can't remember what I was about to say before, but also, like in A Tale of Dunk and Egg, this is why some people in the books, they'll be described as like cold or craven or weak or sickly and stuff like that, is because some of the species just, or some of everybody just can't handle any radiation or any lack of magic. Like they'll wither and die and be cold. Um, but the ones who can, and who can absorb it from like the spirit of others around them and like take heart and shit like that, they're constantly described as like burning bright and like got this fire in them, or blood of the dragon, eggs constantly like loving hot baths, and like Dunk can't handle his like it, how does it get described, like he gets in and like it's a little too hot for him, but it's cooler at the bottom, and like it feels better than um, not taking a bath at all. And Egg wonders if he should boil more water, and he's like, nah, this will serve. Like he's not this person that doesn't want to get too much heat or not heat. And when he looks out at the people at Ashford Meadow, he sees cold faces all around him, or something like that. And he's like, are there no true men among you? And then Baylor Breakspear comes out of the mist, and like just the way he's described immediately, like you can tell it's not Valar, because Valar is described as kind of like, oh meh, like he doesn't have like that dragon flair, whereas Baylor Breakspear is this just presence in and of himself. He has all of this not as refined garb. He only has like a thin circlet of gold around his crown, but that's his only concession to ornament. But he still looks like 10 times finer than all of the noble lords and stuff. So, like certain characters, and I think Baylor, Dunk, Egg, John, Daenerys, like most of the main characters are got this spark in them, got this gene in them that says, yeah, I want this power, I want this heat, I want this, I want this, and I want more of it. And that's why, um, like the Children of the Forest and the First Men and blood sacrifice and all of that was so important in the past, is because when the weirwoods would absorb all of these nutrients, it would they would remember. And that's why remembering is such a big thing, is because the weirwoods will remember, and they will live on, and they will live forever. And Like, they may have cut down the weirwoods now, but in like a million years, that thing's probably going to be like, okay, sprout. Another 2 million years, grow a little bigger. Stuff like that. I don't think weirwoods are actual trees. They're just a super dense manzanita-like fungus. And it's the fungus that evolved on Planetos rather than the black oily fungus that evolved on the moon. And yeah, so now is a good place to end because I have talked for 40 minutes and 40 seconds, just like I thought I would. Anyway, adios, guys. I will talk to you later, and I hope you enjoyed my crackpot theory on the black oily moon, its cause in how radiation is magic, and how Planetos is huge, and the map we see is basically the North Pole. Anyway, bye guys. I hope you have a wonderful day.